August 30th, 2013. Castaic, California. An overturned abandoned SUV belonging to 19-year-old Bryce Laspisa is discovered at the bottom of an embankment near Castaic Lake, but even though most of his personal possessions are still inside the vehicle, Bryce himself is nowhere to be found. While beginning his sophomore year at Sierra College, Bryce had been displaying erratic behavior and seemed to be experiencing issues with drugs and alcohol before he made an inexplicable decision to drive hundreds of miles away. Bryce had told his parents he would be joining them at their home in Laguna Niguel, but he disappears before he arrives, and no trace of him is ever found. After that, the trail went cold. Hello everyone, and welcome to our latest episode of The Trail Went Cold. I'm your host Robin Warder, and on this episode, we're going to be looking into a heavily discussed missing persons case, the 2013 disappearance of Bryce Laspisa. This case was once featured on an episode of Disappeared titled Road to Nowhere, and of course, I've received numerous requests to cover it. In fact, I'll add the disclaimer that this is not the first time I've talked about this story, because nearly 3 years ago, I made a guest appearance on an episode of Riddle Me That True Crime, which was hosted by Jules, one of my co-hosts on my spin-off podcast, The Path Went Chilly. While we had our own discussion about Bryce Laspisa's disappearance, I felt now would be a good time to revisit the case and put together my own episode about it on The Trail Went Cold, as I've always had a particular fascination for mysteries in which people go missing or wind up dead at faraway locations where they seemingly have no reason to be at. Bryce Laspisa grew up in Illinois before his parents decided to relocate to California, and he made the decision to attend Sierra College in Rocklin. While preparing for his sophomore year there, Bryce started to display some very erratic behavior, which included breaking up with his girlfriend via text message. When Bryce's parents were informed about what was going on, he made the sudden decision to drive over 300 miles away to the unincorporated community of Buttonwillow, and he proceeded to remain there for over 12 hours and appeared to spend a good chunk of that time just sitting in his parked car. Bryce assured his parents that he would travel an additional 200 miles to their home in Laguna Niguel, but before he arrived, he turned off the interstate into a remote area before crashing his SUV down the side of an embankment and disappearing. It seemed very apparent that Bryce was suffering from some serious mental health issues at that time and may have been suicidal, but search efforts have failed to turn up any trace of him, and you can't rule out the possibility that Bryce may still be alive out there somewhere, perhaps with no memory of who he is. However, one big source of controversy in this case is that there are a lot of unsubstantiated rumors online about Bryce's parents, and allegations that the narrative presented in the Disappeared episode may have been misleading and did not tell the entire story. As a result, it can sometimes be difficult to separate fact from rumor when performing research on this case, but I'll do my best and spend this episode addressing some of the allegations which have been spread over the years. However, before we get started, just a quick reminder that The Trail Went Cold is a weekly podcast, which is currently available for download on several platforms, including Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, Podcast Addict, and more. So if you like this podcast, be sure to subscribe to it, and please leave us a rating or review on any of those sites to help spread the word and garner us more exposure. The Trail Went Cold is on Patreon, so if you would like to learn how to support the show, please visit our page at patreon.com/thetrailwentcold. For as little as $1 a month, you can garner access to exclusive rewards, including stickers and thank you cards, early access to episodes, and bonus content, as our Patreon page has around 80 exclusive bonus episodes in our archives, which are not available on our regular feed. So with all that out of the way, let us now delve into the disappearance of Bryce Laspisa. Our story begins in California in 2013, and our central figure is 19-year-old Bryce Laspisa. Bryce was born in Illinois and spent much of his childhood living in Naperville, a western suburb of Chicago, with parents Karen and Mike Laspisa. Now, this detail usually isn't mentioned by most sources, but it has been reported that Mike was not Bryce's biological father, though he legally adopted him when he was very young. Ordinarily, this might not be relevant, but I'll be going into more detail about the potential significance of this topic later on in this episode. By the time Bryce graduated from high school in 2012, Karen and Mike were retiring, so the family decided to relocate the family to Laguna Niguel, California, which is located in the San Joaquin Hills in the southeastern corner of Orange County. Since he was a talented artist, Bryce decided that he wanted to continue his post-secondary education by studying graphic and industrial design at Sierra College in Rocklin, which meant he would move over 460 miles away from his parents. If you watch the Disappeared episode about the case, they state that Bryce did really well during his freshman year at Sierra College, but during the earliest media coverage of Bryce's disappearance, his former roommate, Nick Cavina, told the press that Bryce had been evicted from the college dorm. The details about why this happened are very vague, but once again, I'll revisit this topic later on in the episode. Whatever happened, Bryce spent the summer of 2013 with his parents in Laguna Niguel, and when he returned to Sierra College for his sophomore year, he would move into an off-campus apartment in Roseville with a new roommate named Sean Dixon, whom he had become friends with. Bryce was also involved in a relationship with Kim Sly, who was a student at Chico State and lived in the city of Chico over 80 miles away. Bryce began his classes for the fall semester on Monday, August the 26th, but by this point, his friends noticed that he had become withdrawn and depressed and was behaving more erratically. According to Sean and Kim, Bryce's alcohol consumption had greatly increased, as he seemed to be drinking hard liquor every day, and even went so far as to consume 2 full bottles of liquor over the course of one weekend. Bryce also told Kim that he had started taking Vyvanse, a stimulant medication ordinarily used to treat attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, also known as ADHD. Bryce said that he had used Vyvanse to help him stay up late playing video games, but the issue was that he had never officially been diagnosed with ADHD, and the medication had a number of potential side effects, such as mania and psychosis. Even though Kim expressed her concerns about this, Bryce was dismissive of her. Well, on August the 27th, Bryce and Kim were exchanging text messages when he suddenly said that he believed she would be better off without him before breaking up with her. The following day, Bryce met with Sean and gave him his Xbox video game console, as well as a pair of diamond earrings which had been given to him by his mother. When he left their apartment, Bryce apparently told Sean that he would be back on Labor Day as the holiday weekend was coming up, and he later sent him a text message which read, quote, "I love you, bro, seriously. You are the best person I've ever met. You saved my soul," end quote. Sean then decided to call Bryce's parents in Laguna Niguel and let them know that he was worried about Bryce's strange behavior. Well, later that evening, Karen Laspisa received a call from Bryce on his cell phone, and he told her that he had traveled from Roseville to Kim's apartment in Chico in his 2003 Toyota Highlander SUV. Bryce told his mother that he had gotten into an argument with Kim and she had taken away his keys because she believed he might be under the influence of alcohol and Vyvanse and in no condition to drive. In spite of this, Karen felt that Bryce sounded lucid over the phone, and when Kim's roommate got on the line and spoke to her, she assured Karen that Bryce seemed okay to drive. When Kim got on the line, Karen managed to convince her to give Bryce his keys back. Karen then spoke to Bryce again and told him that she was willing to fly out there to check on him, but he asked her to hold off on booking a flight reservation until he had the chance to speak with her again the following day, stating, quote, "I have a lot to talk to you about." Karen advised Bryce to return to his apartment in Roseville to get some sleep, and after the call ended, Bryce left Kim's place at 11:30 p.m. Well, about 90 minutes later, at 1 a.m. on the morning of August 29th, Bryce called his mother again on his cell phone to assure her that everything was okay, but while Karen assumed that he was back at his apartment, phone records would later show that he was still driving at that time and heading south past Roseville. Well, later that morning at around 11 a.m., 10 hours after Bryce's phone call, Karen and Mike received a voicemail from their auto insurance company that roadside assistance service had been requested for Bryce's SUV. When Karen called Bryce's cell phone, there was no answer, and when she called Bryce's apartment, Sean answered and informed her that Bryce had never returned there. After checking their credit card records, the Laspisas noticed that a recent $20 charge had been made that morning in Buttonwillow, an unincorporated community located in Kern County around 280 miles southeast of Roseville. It would have taken Bryce approximately 5.5 hours to drive there from Chico, but since Buttonwillow was just off Interstate 5 and over 180 miles from Laguna Niguel, Karen and Mike wondered if Bryce might have been on his way to see them before something happened. Mike traced the credit card charge to a repair shop in Buttonwillow called Castro Tire and Truck, and when he phoned them, the call was answered by a roadside assistance serviceman named Christian. Christian told Mike that Bryce's SUV had run out of fuel at the southbound Interstate 5 Buttonwillow rest area at around 9 a.m. that morning, so Bryce called roadside assistance, and Christian was asked to deliver 3 gallons of gasoline to him, which Bryce purchased via credit card. Since the rest area was only a 15-minute drive away, Christian offered to go check if Bryce's SUV was still there. The Laspisas agreed to this, and shortly thereafter, Christian called them back on his cell phone and told them that he was now at the rest area, but Bryce was still parked there in his SUV, even though around 6 hours had passed since he received the fuel. Christian also said that Bryce's eyes looked a little red, so he handed Bryce his cell phone to speak to his parents. When Karen asked what Bryce was doing there, he simply replied nothing, so Karen advised him to drive to Laguna Niguel to see them, which would take just over 3 hours. Bryce agreed to do so, and after handing Christian's cell phone back to him, he finally drove away from the rest area at around 3 p.m. Well, several hours passed, and Bryce never arrived in Laguna Niguel, and even though the Laspisas left several voicemails for Bryce, he never answered his phone or called them back. Finally, at around 9 p.m., the Laspisas contacted the Orange County Sheriff's Department in order to officially report Bryce missing. The Sheriff's Department asked the Laspisas' cellular provider to track Bryce's phone, and after using cell towers to ping its location, they were surprised to discover that it was on Lagoon Drive in Buttonwillow, only 8 miles away from the rest area where Bryce had interacted with Christian. A pair of Kern County Sheriff's deputies were dispatched to this location, and they discovered that Bryce's SUV was parked by the side of the road. The deputies spoke to Bryce and asked him to perform a field sobriety test, which he wound up passing, and they later reported that Bryce was quite friendly and lucid and did not appear to be intoxicated. Bryce also gave consent for them to perform a search of the SUV, which turned up no trace of drugs or alcohol. When the deputies asked Bryce what he was doing at this location, he simply replied that he needed to blow off a little steam. They informed Bryce that his parents were worried and advised him to call them, but he seemed hesitant to do so until one of the deputies dialed the number for him on Bryce's cell phone. Before speaking with Bryce, Karen asked the deputy if he felt that Bryce was okay to drive home, and the deputy expressed his belief that he was. Bryce was finally put on the line, and when Karen asked why he had spent the past several hours in Buttonwillow, he didn't really provide an answer, but he assured his mother that he was now going to complete the drive back home to Laguna Niguel before the call ended. Well, earlier that evening, Karen had left a message for Christian, and shortly after her call with Bryce, Christian phoned her back, and Karen informed him that Bryce was still in Buttonwillow. Christian then offered to go back to the location on Lagoon Drive where Bryce had been parked to check if he was still there, and sure enough, 15 minutes later, Christian called Karen back on his cell phone and informed her that Bryce was still parked at that spot. But Christian told Karen that he would keep an eye on Bryce to make sure he left the area, and a short time later, he called Karen again to assure her that he had seen Bryce finally drive away onto Interstate 5 and head south. Christian said that he followed Bryce in that direction for 10 miles before turning over and turning around, but Bryce appeared to be heading in the direction of Laguna Niguel. Over the course of the next few hours, Bryce and his parents exchanged several calls where they asked Bryce to describe landmarks and street signs he saw so they could keep track of his progress. While Bryce sometimes came across as evasive by saying that he couldn't see any signs, he did tell his parents that his GPS said he would arrive home at 3:25 a.m. on Friday, August the 30th. At 2:09 a.m., Bryce phoned Karen and let her know that he had become too tired to keep driving, so he had pulled off the interstate in order to get some sleep. Karen said this was a good idea and told Bryce she would see him when he returned home later that morning. The call soon ended, but this would turn out to be the last time Bryce was confirmed to be alive. Well, 6 hours later, shortly after 8 a.m., the doorbell rang at the Laspisa residence, but while Karen and Mike were expecting it to be Bryce, they were surprised to see a California Highway Patrol officer standing there. He informed the Laspisas that around 5:30 that morning, Bryce's abandoned SUV had been found overturned on its side at the bottom of a steep 25-foot embankment in the unincorporated community of Castaic, located in northeastern Los Angeles County, near the halfway point between Buttonwillow and Laguna Niguel. It had crashed near Castaic Lake, a reservoir in the Sierra Pelona Mountains, and was lying on its side on a closed access road to the Castaic Lake boat launch ramp. It turned out that Bryce had turned off the interstate onto Lake Hughes Road, as a surveillance camera captured still images of Bryce's SUV and its license plate traveling uphill on the road at 2:15 a.m., 6 minutes after his final phone call with Karen. Oddly, the same camera would capture images of the SUV and its license plate traveling in the same direction on Lake Hughes Road over 2 hours later at 4:29 a.m. Based on tire tracks found at the scene, it was apparent that the SUV soon changed direction and drove alongside the service area for a cell tower before it headed downhill again. The vehicle traveled through some vegetation while its undercarriage apparently hit some large rocks before it plummeted forward off the edge of the 25-foot embankment onto the access road below and fell over on its side. The tire tracks seemed to indicate that Bryce was hitting the accelerator while the SUV traveled downhill, and since it was headed in the direction of Castaic Lake, one theory pushed forward is that Bryce was making an intentional attempt to drive into the lake, but misjudged the distance because of the darkness, which is why the SUV wound up turning over on the road. The vehicle's rear window had been shattered and was likely broken by Bryce when he escaped. While small spots of blood were found on the passenger side headrest and the back seat, there was not a large amount of blood in or around the SUV to indicate that Bryce had been seriously injured. Bryce's cell phone and laptop were still inside the vehicle, while his wallet and a duffel bag were found on the ground outside the rear window. Since the bag was zipped open, it was possible that Bryce took something from it before he left the scene. Over the next several days, a massive search effort was performed of the surrounding area for Bryce, but no trace of him could be found. Castaic Lake was also extensively searched by divers and dredged, but they failed to find Bryce's body in the water. A pair of cadaver dogs managed to track Bryce's scent to a nearby dam and followed it across a roadway to a concrete spillway on the left side of the lake, but the scent abruptly came to an end at a truck stop on Castaic Road. As far as I can tell, there were no reports of anyone matching Bryce's description at that truck stop, and even though a number of eyewitness sightings of Bryce would be investigated in places like Oregon, none of them panned out. At around 6 a.m. on September the 4th, 5 days after Bryce was last seen, a cyclist called 911 to report a brush fire on the north side of Lake Hughes Road, just 3 miles away from the spot where Bryce's abandoned SUV was found. When first responders arrived at the scene and put out the fire, they discovered the charred remains of a burned body. However, it was soon determined that the body did not belong to Bryce, but rather a 35-year-old man named Lamondre Dion Miles, who had been shot several times in south-central Los Angeles over an alleged money dispute. 3 suspects, 23-year-old Joanna Amezcua, her 22-year-old brother Luis Amezcua, and Joanna's 33-year-old boyfriend Javier Vega, then decided to transport Miles's body to Castaic before disposing of it and setting it on fire, and it was nothing more than a coincidence that this occurred in the same area where Bryce happened to go missing. Over the next few years, Karen and Mike Laspisa kept spreading awareness about their son's disappearance and doing everything they could to keep his story in the spotlight. At one point, the Laspisas chartered a sonar boat in order to spend 2 days performing their own search of Castaic Lake, but they failed to find anything. They also hired the services of a private investigator who got a drone operator to search the area surrounding the lake, but their efforts once again came up empty. In April of 2016, Bryce's case received national exposure when it was featured on an episode of Disappeared titled Road to Nowhere, However, it did not lead the case any closer to a resolution, and there have been no new developments in the investigation in quite some time. So after 11 years, Bryce Laspisa continues to remain a missing person. So I guess you could say the trail went cold. So there are quite a few missing persons cases out there in which a victim gets into a vehicular accident and then disappears from the scene and is never found. Obviously, the most famous example of this is probably the 2004 disappearance of Maura Murray, and I've sometimes seen Bryce Laspisa's disappearance get referred to as the male version of the Maura Murray case. You can definitely see a number of parallels between the two stories, as both victims have been going through a number of personal issues and displaying erratic behavior before they inexplicably drove out to an unfamiliar area, crashed their vehicle, and vanished without a trace. I guess a key difference between the two cases is that Maura vanished in New Hampshire during a cold winter night in February, whereas Bryce disappeared in California in late August. This meant the search effort for Bryce wouldn't have been hampered as much by the weather, though that doesn't necessarily mean that the searchers couldn't have missed his remains, and they are not still out in Los Angeles County somewhere waiting to be found. But another parallel with Maura's case is that there also seems to be a lot of wild speculation and online drama surrounding Bryce's disappearance, particularly when it comes to not-so-nice things being said about his family. During the intro, I mentioned that I had a discussion about this case nearly 3 years ago with my Path Went Chilly co-host Jules on her podcast, Riddle Me That True Crime, and I briefly addressed some of the uncorroborated online gossip surrounding this whole story. I'm going to explore this angle in more detail on today's episode, but I also want to do so as delicately as possible, since there are a number of rumors out there which don't paint Bryce's parents, Karen and Mike Laspisa, in the most positive light. In fact, if you search online discussions about this case, you're going to find a lot of criticism directed towards their handling of this whole affair. Some people have found it quite concerning that the Laspisas were not proactive enough when Bryce started displaying erratic behavior. As you recall, Bryce's girlfriend Kim had taken away his keys because she believed he was in no condition to drive, but Karen convinced her to give them back. Over the course of the next day, the Laspisas would learn that Bryce had traveled to Buttonwillow and was inexplicably sitting in his parked SUV doing nothing for hours at a time. Many online posters have said that if the same thing had happened with their child, they would have immediately hopped into their vehicle and driven to Buttonwillow to see what was going on, rather than entrusting Bryce to complete his lengthy drive to their home while he was in that state of mind. Now, I ordinarily like to avoid casting blame on victims and their families, and this could be one of those hindsight is 20/20 situations in which Bryce's parents wish they had done things a lot differently, but genuinely believe that they were doing the right thing at that time. To be fair to them, even if the Laspisas had decided to make the 3-hour drive from their home in Laguna Niguel to Buttonwillow, there's no guarantee that Bryce would have still been there by the time they arrived, and he may have still gone missing no matter what. However, there have been allegations about much darker undercurrents in Bryce's relationship with his parents. If you want an eerie time capsule into the past, Bryce Laspisa actually has a YouTube channel under his own name, which he put together a couple months before he went missing. One of the videos Bryce posted was a 10-minute short film he directed titled Family Secrets, which I believe may have been a school project, and both of his parents even have roles in it. Two of Bryce's friends play a pair of brothers who keep having a series of weird dreams about seeing a ghost, and Karen and Mike play the brothers' parents. In the film, Karen confesses to the boys that she is not their biological mother, as their birth mother actually died in a car accident alongside an older sister they never even knew they had. The two brothers then confront Mike for not telling them about this, and he brashly reveals that their birth mother was not that great, and their sister got out of control one too many times and had it coming. Later on, the brothers are visited by the ghosts of their mother and their sister, who reveal that they were murdered by their father. Well, when you learn more information about the family dynamics of the Laspisas, this short film is incredibly weird to watch. Now, in the Disappeared episode about the case, the narrative presented by the Laspisas is that Bryce was a very happy, well-adjusted, and well-liked young man who got along with everybody. They said that he did very well during his freshman year at Sierra College, but after he returned there for his sophomore year in August of 2013, Bryce's behavior drastically changed, and they make it sound like his downward spiral took place very rapidly over the course of a period of about 2.5 weeks. Well, 6 years ago, a thread was made about this case at the Unresolved Mysteries subreddit, which featured some very interesting comments by a poster under the username The Anonymous Hooligan, who seemed to have a lot of inside knowledge of the situation and shared some very interesting information. Over the course of the next few years, the Anonymous Hooligan would pop up and leave additional comments in numerous Reddit threads about this case, but I will add the disclaimer that if you check their profile, it now says that the Reddit account has been suspended. There are some places out there which seem to take claims from the Anonymous Hooligan as fact, but there's no way to verify if most of this information is true, so obviously, take everything you hear right now with a huge grain of salt. Long story short, the Anonymous Hooligan has some very unflattering things to say about Mike and particularly Karen Laspisa, alleging that they were controlling parents and that the relationship with Bryce was emotionally abusive, manipulative, and borderline codependent. The implication seems to be that they are not telling the full truth about their relationship with Bryce out of potential fear of public embarrassment. The Anonymous Hooligan claims that Bryce's issues with alcohol started while he was a teenager and that while attending his high school in Illinois, he was busted for possession of the drug MDMA, aka ecstasy. In fact, this has been cited as one of the reasons that the Laspisas decided to relocate from Illinois to California so Bryce could attend college there, but his issues with drugs and alcohol, as well as his apparent mental health struggles, only got worse. Again, I have no idea if these allegations are true, but one detail shared in the Anonymous Hooligan's comments which does check out, and was not mentioned on the Disappeared episode, is that Bryce was evicted from his dorm during his freshman year at Sierra College for partying-related issues. This information has been publicly shared by Bryce's former roommate, Nick Cavina, who spoke to the Sacramento-based television station KRCA-TV during a news segment they produced in the days following Bryce's disappearance. According to Nick, Bryce's eviction caused their friendship to end, and since Bryce partied harder than most students, Nick wasn't surprised by his disappearance, stating, quote, "I expected nothing good could come from the path he was on," end quote. I know that college dorms usually deal with partying students all the time, but I have to think that they would only take the step of evicting them if there was an ongoing problem or something serious happened. Nick also mentioned that Bryce moved to Sierra College to start over after a troubled past, which could support the allegations that Bryce had been busted for drug possession in Illinois. So yeah, this definitely indicates to me that Bryce's issues did not just suddenly start 2.5 weeks before he went missing. I mentioned earlier that even though this detail isn't shared by most sources, it has been reported that Mike Laspisa is not actually Bryce's biological father. I searched for corroboration on this and found an interview conducted in August of 2022 by the Los Angeles-based radio station KFI-AM 640, where one of the lead investigators on this case, Detective Sergeant Robert Martindale of the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department, did confirm that Mike legally adopted Bryce when he was a young kid. So why does this matter? Well, virtually all of the sources you're going to find out there refer to Bryce as Karen and Mike's only child, but according to the Reddit comments from the Anonymous Hooligan, Bryce actually had a half-sister who was 5 years older than him and was Mike's daughter from a previous marriage. It's been alleged that she was raised by her birth mother, who died when the girl was 13 years old, so she wound up moving in with the Laspisas. However, the story goes that Karen reportedly did not treat Mike's daughter very well, and she eventually wound up being kicked out of the house and becoming completely estranged from her family. It does not sound like Bryce and his half-sister had been in contact for years prior to his disappearance, And once again, I obviously cannot say with 100% certainty that these claims are true. But if they are, it is odd that Karen and Mike have seemingly pretended like this girl never existed during their media appearances. As you recall, that short film Bryce directed, called Family Secrets, features Mike playing a father who murdered his wife and daughter and never told his sons about them, and Karen plays their adoptive mother. Hell, there's even a line in the film in which Mike tells his sons that their sister got out of control one too many times and had it coming, so you have to wonder if these might have been some thinly veiled jabs at his birth daughter, and if Bryce used his real-life family situation as inspiration for this project. Now, obviously, I'm not trying to imply that Bryce's parents were personally responsible for his disappearance, as that's definitely not the case, but the anonymous hooligan seems inclined to believe that Bryce might have disappeared voluntarily in order to free himself from their controlling nature. During their comments, the anonymous hooligan theorizes that Bryce may have been planning to travel to Laguna Niguel to finally confront his parents before he completely cut them out of his life and started over. However, it's possible that Bryce got cold feet and changed his plans, which could provide an explanation for why he spent those long stretches of time in Buttonwillow just sitting inside his parked SUV doing nothing. He later wound up driving to Castaic and crashing his SUV before he fled the scene, but Bryce may have made prior arrangements to meet someone who could help him disappear and start a new life. In fact, the anonymous hooligan has speculated that since there haven't been any new developments in the investigation in quite some time, law enforcement may have already determined that Bryce is still alive somewhere and uncovered his current whereabouts, but for privacy reasons, they have declined to share this information because Bryce specifically told them that he does not want his parents to find out where he is. In fact, some of the other commenters on Reddit have expressed their belief that the anonymous hooligan might have been Bryce himself, since they were sharing so many vivid details about the situation. But I'll state right up front that regardless of whether or not you believe these allegations about Bryce's parents are true, I do not believe that law enforcement has found Bryce and are keeping quiet about it. There are many other documented cases, some of which have even been featured on Disappeared, in which missing people have been found alive, and as long as they don't have any pending criminal charges against them, law enforcement will generally respect their privacy and not publicly disclose any information about their whereabouts if they wish to be left alone. However, even if they don't share any specific details, law enforcement will at the very least make some sort of announcement to confirm that the victim has been found safely and that the case is now closed. I mean, Bryce's case has been in the spotlight for over a decade now and has been featured all over true crime media, and he's got a more distinct and recognizable face than most missing persons. If Bryce was found alive, but the public was given the false impression that he was still missing, then this could cause law enforcement to waste a lot of time and resources following up on tips and leads for a case that has already been solved. So, to avoid any confusion, I really think that even if Bryce wanted to maintain his privacy, some sort of announcement would be made if the investigation was now closed. So I know that when a victim goes missing or is murdered, their loved ones will want to portray them in the best possible light because the true crime community can be unnecessarily judgmental if they believe a victim made some bad choices which put them in their situation. Well, there is no such thing as a perfect victim, and none of them deserve to go missing or be murdered, no matter what they may have done. But at the same time, it's never beneficial for the victims' families to create a false narrative about them, because that can hamper the investigation and make it more difficult to figure out what happened to them. I really have no idea if Bryce's parents are as bad as the anonymous hooligan has portrayed them to be, but I really don't have a hard time believing that the Disappeared episode may have greatly downplayed Bryce's personal issues. But to the show's credit, they did not shy away from the possibility that Bryce's mental health issues may have caused him to become suicidal, and he made a failed attempt to intentionally drown himself by driving into Castaic Lake. Even though he survived and walked away from the SUV crash, I certainly wouldn't rule out the idea that he went on to kill himself at another location and is yet to be found. If the allegations from the anonymous hooligan are true, and Bryce had been planning to drive home to confront his parents and cut them out of his life, I can see how the extreme anxiety of the whole situation could have made him believe that suicide was a better option. There were definitely warning signs that Bryce was thinking of ending his own life, as he suddenly broke up with his girlfriend Kim by text messaging, gave away his Xbox and a pair of diamond earrings to his roommate Sean, and then sent Sean a sentimental text about how much he loved him and how Sean saved his soul. It sounds like Bryce was drinking heavily during this time period and had been taking the ADHD medication Vyvanse. We know that Bryce was never diagnosed with ADHD and likely would not have been able to acquire Vyvanse through a legal prescription, but none of the sources out there have ever mentioned how exactly he obtained it. But Vyvanse has a number of potential side effects when it is not taken properly, such as mania and psychosis, so if Bryce was abusing the drug, this could have led to him suffering a mental breakdown. One theory I've seen pushed forward in Reddit threads about this case is that Bryce may have driven all the way to Buttonwillow to score drugs off someone, but that person did not show up. In fact, a couple of commenters even chimed in to share their own past experiences with drug addiction and confirmed that if you are desperate enough, you can sometimes be willing to wait as long as Bryce did in Buttonwillow if there's a chance you'll get some drugs. Well, I've personally never put much stock into this theory because, as far as I know, Bryce had no ties to Buttonwillow or anyone who lived in the area, and since it was located over 4 hours away from his apartment in Roseville, I'm not sure why he would need to drive such a long distance to acquire drugs. Even if Bryce had substance abuse problems during this time period, I'm not entirely sure if they played a role in his disappearance. Remember, while he was in Buttonwillow, Bryce did pass a field sobriety test, which was administered by a pair of sheriff's deputies who felt he was lucid at the time, and his search of his SUV failed to turn up any drugs or alcohol. It's possible that Bryce spent all that time there for reasons that only he understood, and he was contemplating what he wanted to do next. Now, one thing which has never been made clear to me is why Bryce decided to pay a visit to Kim's apartment on the evening of August the 28th, even though he had broken up with her via text the previous day. She was living in Chico, which is over 80 miles northwest of Roseville, but what reason did Bryce have to make such a lengthy trip? I haven't heard anything about him apologizing to Kim or attempting to get back together with her, but whatever happened, she found Bryce's behavior to be concerning enough that she took away the keys to his SUV and only gave them back when Karen asked her to over the phone. But this is the location where Bryce talked his mother into not taking a flight up there to see him and said he would speak to her tomorrow before uttering the cryptic line, quote, "I have a lot to talk to you about." Well, if you believe the anonymous hooligans theory that Bryce was planning to confront his parents and sever all ties with them, then this line takes on a whole new meaning. Bryce told Karen that he was planning to drive back to his apartment in Roseville, but it's apparent that he never went there, but just kept heading south in the direction of Laguna Niguel, which is 8.5 hours away from Chico and would have required him to drive all night. The scenario presented by the anonymous hooligan is that Bryce wanted to confront his parents directly to their face and possibly even leave his SUV with them since they were the ones who paid for it. While I can't be 100% certain that this was Bryce's original plan, it does explain why he wound up in Buttonwillow, since it would have been on his route if he kept traveling south on Interstate 5. It seems like the only reason he stopped there was because he ran out of gas and needed to call roadside assistance to have fuel delivered to him at 9 a.m. on the morning of the 29th, which is a sign that he was not thinking logically or in the most rational state of mind. Since the Labor Day holiday weekend was coming up, and Bryce flat out told Sean that he would be back on Labor Day, it ordinarily would not seem unusual for Bryce to make a lengthy drive to Laguna Niguel to see his parents. But the fact that he decided to drive all night and did not even initially tell his parents he was going to do this is definitely a sign that something was wrong. Even though his last name has never been released publicly, and he has shied away from the spotlight and never done any interviews, it appears that the unsung hero in this story was Christian, the roadside assistance officer who went out of his way to check on Bryce during his time in Buttonwillow and kept his parents informed about what was going on. I suppose that Christian's generosity might be the main reason that many online sleuths have directed criticism towards Karen and Mike, as they find it odd that this complete stranger seemed to be more proactive and concerned about Bryce's well-being than his own parents. We know that after his interaction with the Kern County Sheriff's deputies, Bryce seemed very reluctant to speak with his mother over the phone, and even though he promised her he would complete the drive to Laguna Niguel, he did not actually leave Buttonwillow until Christian started watching over him and followed him out of town. Without Christian's intervention, I'd be curious to see if Bryce may have done things differently, but I have to harken back to the theory presented by the anonymous hooligan that Bryce had developed cold feet about confronting his parents, which is why he spent all those hours just sitting around in Buttonwillow figuring out what to do next. I have no idea if Bryce took the opportunity to get any sleep during the time periods he was parked in his SUV, but assuming he didn't, he would have been awake for over 24 hours before the crash during the early morning hours of August the 30th. And depending on what time he woke up on August the 28th, he could have gone between 40 to 48 hours with no sleep. While Bryce did stay in phone contact with Karen for 80 miles after driving away from Buttonwillow, he got off the interstate in Castaic after informing her that he was too tired to complete the drive home and needed some sleep. We know that a surveillance camera captured Bryce's SUV driving down Lake Hughes Road at 2:15 a.m., only a few minutes after his final phone call, but what's particularly bizarre is that it captured him passing by the camera again and heading in the same direction over 2 hours later at 4:29. I don't know if Bryce used this 134-minute window to stop somewhere and get some sleep, but knowing what we know about his time in Buttonwillow, he may have simply sat around in his SUV while it was parked, and the disturbing implication is he was spending that time contemplating suicide. From what I can tell, there really was no logical reason for Bryce to drive uphill to that cell tower service area, and even though Lake Hughes Road had a guardrail running alongside it, there was a small opening at the service area, which probably explains why Bryce turned there. It seems very unlikely that Bryce could have skidded off the road and gone downhill by accident, and judging by the tracks found at the scene, the SUV seemed to be intentionally accelerating when it sped towards the steep embankment. On the Disappeared episode, the theory presented is that Bryce may have been intentionally trying to drive his vehicle into Castaic Lake, but misjudged how far it was due to the darkness and wound up overturning on the access road instead. The evidence indicates that Bryce survived the crash and broke out of the vehicle, but since there were only small spots of blood found at the scene, it's unclear if he was seriously injured or if he may have suffered some sort of mental breakdown which caused him to develop amnesia and forget who he was. It appears that Bryce left behind all of his personal possessions in his SUV, though I suppose we can't rule out the possibility that he removed something from his unzipped duffel bag. But since he didn't take all these items with him or make any attempt to call for help on his cell phone, this suggests that Bryce was either seriously disoriented or planning to follow through on his attempted suicide. Even though an extensive search of Castaic Lake failed to turn up Bryce's body, it's certainly possible that he could have ran over to the lake and drowned himself. Castaic Lake is 320,000 acres and has a depth of over 300 feet in some spots, so even the best search efforts could have failed to find him in the water. It's also possible that Bryce wandered off somewhere and died of exposure, and his remains have yet to be found, but the biggest piece of evidence that suggests that Bryce could have made it out of the area are the cadaver dogs tracking his scent to a nearby truck stop before it abruptly came to an end. This implies that Bryce could have hitched a ride with a trucker, but thus far, no one has ever come forward to admit having picked him up. One theory which almost never gets pushed forward in this case is the possibility of Bryce being the victim of foul play, because let's face it, what are the odds of him crossing paths with a killer in such a remote area in the middle of the night? Since the surveillance camera captured images of the SUV and its license plates, but not Bryce, I guess we technically can't say for certain that he was the one driving the vehicle on Lake Hughes Road, but I have no reason to believe he wasn't. I suppose if Bryce went on to hitch a ride with the wrong person, he could have been murdered, but it seems like the more likely scenarios are either suicide, Bryce dying of exposure, or him still being alive out there somewhere. But given that he left everything behind, and there's been no paper trail for Bryce these past 11 years, if he is still alive, he could be out there living a transient lifestyle. I harken back to the theory presented by the anonymous hooligan that Bryce was planning to cut off all ties with his parents and start afresh, but I don't see how he could have done this without help, or how anyone would have even known he was in Castaic that night. Let's not forget that Bryce left his cell phone behind, so investigators would have been able to check his activity to see if he communicated with anyone else besides his parents right before he went missing, and they've never given off any indication that this is the case. If Bryce was covertly communicating with someone, he probably would have needed to use a burner phone. I guess if there's any truth to these allegations about Bryce suffering through a controlling, manipulative, and emotionally abusive relationship with his parents, he may have changed his mind about severing ties with them, which is why he ultimately decided that suicide was the best option and drove off the interstate towards Castaic Lake. He could have spent that 2-hour gap on Lake Hughes Road brainstorming what he wanted to do next, but things didn't go as planned when the SUV turned over. But until Bryce's remains are found, we can only speculate about what happened and not completely write off the possibility that he might still be alive. The trouble with figuring out what happened to Bryce is that we have no idea how truthful these comments left on Reddit by the anonymous hooligan really are. If everything they are saying about Karen and Mike Laspisa is a complete lie, then I apologize in advance for mentioning them, but since these rumors have become so widespread in discussions about this case, I felt that I at least needed to address them on this episode. For all we know, perhaps Bryce's disappearance was the result of completely unrelated mental health issues, as we really have no idea what was going on in his head during this time period. But someday, maybe we'll finally get some conclusive answers. So if you happen to have any information about the disappearance of Bryce Laspisa, please contact the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department at 323-890-5500. That's 323-890-5500. But if you just have your own thoughts about what happened, feel free to leave me a comment or send me an email to robin.warder@icloud.com. That's robin.warder@icloud.com. Now the reminder that The Trail Went Cold is on Patreon, so please visit patreon.com/thetrailwentcold to learn how you can support our podcast and become eligible for some pretty neat rewards. Over the past 6 years, our Patreon page has released around 80 exclusive bonus episodes, which are all currently available in our archives for our patrons in tiers 2 and 3. This past month, I released a Halloween-themed bonus episode about reincarnation, which covers the controversial Unsolved Mysteries segment about Georgia Rudolph and her belief that she was the reincarnation of a young woman who died at the turn of the 20th century. I've also dropped an exclusive bonus episode from my spin-off podcast, The Path Went Chilly, in which myself and one of my co-hosts, Jules, discuss a bizarre case from Unsolved Mysteries, the 1984 disappearance and subsequent death of Tim Molnar. And for our patrons in Tier 3, I've recorded another new audio commentary track, which can be played over a classic episode of Unsolved Mysteries, and we now have nearly 70 of these commentary tracks in our archives. I'd also like to give a shout out to our most recent listeners who have signed up with us on Patreon this week, and they are Mel C., Lynette W., Noel V., and Lauren Y. Thank you all so much for your support. I just wanted to give another shout out to my supporters at the Unsolved Mysteries message board at the Sitcoms Online forum, and the Unresolved Mysteries subreddit, which has a number of interesting threads about this case containing the aforementioned comments by the anonymous hooligan. I need to provide a big thanks to Miguel Foote, who edits and assembles this podcast together for me, and Vince Nitro, who composed the eerie music you hear on every episode. If you haven't already, you can like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter and Instagram, or leave us a rating or review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, Podcast Addict, or whatever your favorite podcasting platform is. So have yourselves a great week and join us next Wednesday for another brand new episode of The Trail Went Cold.